Now, Nicolas Ignacio Silva is going to give us a presentation named Why the Values in Science Discussion Needs Input from Experimental Philosophy. He is from University of Chile. So good luck, Nicolas.
Thank you for the introduction. I'm going to share the PowerPoint. Are you all able to see it? Cool.
Yes.
Well, yeah. Well, the thesis that I want to defend. Well, first of all, thank you for the organization of the event. It's really nice to be here. And the thesis of my presentation is what's in the title, basically. So there is a discussion in philosophy of science that is called the Values in Science discussion. And I want to argue that a different tradition, that of the tradition known as experimental philosophy, has methods that should be used in the context of the Values in Science discussion. And yeah, the presentation will be like first contextualizing a bit, what is the Values in Science discussion? Then what is experimental philosophy, and in particular, what is cross-cultural experimental philosophy? Then I will show the present form of the debate in the Values in Science discussion that has been called the new demarcation problem. In a recent issue that got published just this year, a lot of philosophers of science and philosophical community have identified the problem of values as a new central problem for the philosophy of science. And after this initial contextualization, I'm going to argue why cross-cultural experimental philosophy is important for values in science. First, through showing the importance of case studies for the discussion. And then I'm going to use like a second sort of argument that is kind of empirical, but it's speculative still. That is the case of Confucian science and how Confucian or Chinese values affect certain epistemic practices. And I understand that sometimes talking about Chinese science or Oriental science carries with it a history of bias, of Orientalism. So I'm a student of philosophy very concerned with cross-cultural work, and I understand that this is a dimension, and please be aware that I'm conscious that I might be making generalizations or saying things that might be problematic, but I beg your understanding in that respect. Is something I'm learning with time. And at the end of the presentation, I'm going to wrap up as to, well, what we established during the course of the presentation. So first, what is the values in science discussion? There is a common sense picture that we have facts on one side and values on the other. And how the world has nothing to do with how it ought to be. So we can trace this back to David Hume, and it's a common assumption in science that the values of scientists don't matter at all for the kind of science they do. So we could basically have the same science, even if we have an American scientist, a Nazi scientist, a Soviet scientist. The concept of science will not be affected by the values of the scientific community. And the values in science discussion arises because people start to reject this common sense picture. And why they reject it? Given that it's counterintuitive, I deem it important to talk about the arguments for this. First is the argument from a philosopher known as philosopher called Heather Douglas. That is the argument from inductive risk. The argument is that science is not done in a geometric deductive fashion, so that we establish a scientific truth and that truth is true forever, so to speak. Science is done in a probabilistic basis, so that we're never certain of the chance of something happening, of the chance of something being the case. So accepting this first, and then accepting that relying on hypotheses for further scientific work and relying on hypotheses, for example, for policy, is something that can't be done in a decimal fashion or continuous fashion. I can't say, yeah, I will endorse this hypothesis 0.6%. I endorse it or I don't endorse it. There's no middle ground there. So given that science is done on probabilistic grounds, what determines if I'm going to endorse or not a hypothesis? And the argument from Douglas is that values, sets of values, determine whether I'm going to endorse it or not. And the usual case is the case from toxicology in chemistry. I have a 99.99% chance that a chemical is not toxic. But if I endorse the inference that it is not toxic, then people will start putting that chemical in all food and beverages, for example. Even if the chance is so slim that the chemical is toxic, the consequences of that error will be so great that I'm not going to endorse the inference. So that's the basic intuition there, and that's why I include this mini slide here. Saying something has sufficient evidence, strong evidence, or limited evidence, for example, in cancer, has all sorts of layers to it, to the judgment of saying something is sufficient evidence for supporting a hypothesis. And the point is that saying something is sufficient or strong or limited is not something done in an algorithmic evidential fashion, but it depends on the context of error, of the importance of the research, etc. And the second sort of argument is the values of the gap argument. And here in this GIF, you can say that there is a bunch of dots that can be connected in very different ways for explaining the behavior. And the point is that when you have a certain group of evidence, the gap between the evidence and the theories and models you can defend in base of that evidence is not closed by merely evidential matters or epistemic matters. And a real life example is the case of archaeology. Given that in some cases the evidence in archaeology is so slim, there was a long tradition of archaeological theories that put men at the center of cultural evolution. So we have this figure of man the hunter, of men being the drivers of cultural change. But then there was a feminist movement in archaeology that said, even under the same set of evidence, we can craft theories that give women like a more prominent place in history, and they're able to defend the role that women have had in the cultural evolution of different societies. So that is a real case of how the gap between evidence and theories can depend on the values that we have. So this gives place to the new demarcation problem. In reference to the classic problem of demarcation, that for those who don't know, is a problem of separating science from pseudoscience. Given that we accept that values play a legitimate role, that values have to play a role, how do we separate legitimate from illegitimate uses of values in science? And there are many theories that focus on many different things, but that is the basic problem, basically. We have to include values, how to include them in a legitimate fashion. Well, that is one set of the context. The other set of context is what is experimental philosophy. First, this is anchored in the Anglophone analytic tradition. Well, the basic form of the discussions, as some of you may know, is that we have theories about philosophical topics like knowledge, personal identity, etc. And philosopher one proposes a theory. So knowledge is when you have A, B, C conditions. Philosopher two says, oh, but the case C has A, B, C conditions and is not knowledge. And this is the usual dialectic in analytic philosophy discussions, that we propose theories and we falsify them, so to speak, through cases. But when you propose a case, a counterexample, to argue against a theory or for a theory, you rely on yet unargued intuitions, irreflexive gut responses to test, defend, and improve theories. For example, we might say that you all suddenly become psychologically convinced that I'm not wearing shoes right now. Maybe you're right that I'm not wearing shoes, and not saying that's the case, but someone could say, but that's not knowledge. And we understand that intuitive judgment as something we have to take into account, even though the intuitive judgment is not argued for. But given this usual dialectic of the debate, people started to think that philosophers are very peculiar people, especially the ones that have been famous, so to speak. So they're Western, they're white, they're affluent, they're male mostly. So might it be that their gut responses are systematically skewed? Might it be that these people have specific intuitions that not all people share? And so, given this intuition, this problem, people started making surveys, started making all sorts of data gathering on the general population across cultures and within the same cultures to see if people had different ideas about philosophical cases, counterexamples, etc. And spoiler alert, multiple findings show systematic important differences in intuitions about cases and other aspects between cultures, people within the same culture. So experiential philosophy has discovered that people have different intuitions. And what to do with this data is a contested issue still. So yeah, that's the basic thing about experimental philosophy, testing people's intuitions and ideas about philosophical topics. Well, the first set of arguments to why we should connect experimental philosophy to the values and science discussion is the importance of case studies. First, central notions important for some normative accounts in reference to, remember, the new demarcation problem, are defended through and motivated by case studies. So, for example, research on AIDS is used by the philosopher Helen Longino to argue that the criteria of equality of intellectual authority should be something we have in mind for thinking about values in science. Because this example, taken from a very specific context, makes us see, so to speak, that if we had intellectual authority in certain scientific endeavors, science will be better, the values in science will be better. The thing is, for example, the AIDS research is a case taken from the United States. So might it be that if we start taking cases from other cultures, for example, I don't know, like in Asia, in Turkey, in Chile, and whatever, these cases, for being in a different set of contexts, would motivate and defend different sets of ideas and different sets of criteria. Second, there is a role for reflective judgments about cases to guide our normative theorizing. Well, that's a mouthful, but people propose theories in the values and science discussion, and then someone says, hey, but this context has the conditions of your theory, but we intuitively are able to say that it is not a case of legitimate influence of values. For example, the case of commercial values in pharmacological research, we might say, well, this complies with your set of criteria for saying that values are legitimate, but we reflectively think that it can be right. I mean, it can be right that commercial values play a legitimate role in this research. So there is a place, just as in traditional philosophy, for these gut responses, so to speak, and that is precisely the same argument or the same motivation for doing experimental philosophy in other fields. So if intuitions play the same role here, I think it is reasonable to think that experimental philosophy should also play a role. And the third feature that one more important to me, at least, is that if you start to read the discussion, you see that the analogies and concepts are always social and political in a sense. So people defend that democratic communities are important for science, for values in science, that there should be accountability, there should be a role for consensus, there is the importance of pluralism, even a role for social justice. And for time, I'm just going to be rhetorical here, but is someone impressed by the fact that left-leaning academics in the United States, that is the longest surviving democracy in the world, have these democratic political intuitions about how we should regulate science? I know it's not an argument, but I think it's fair to say that there is a prima facie case to think that the social context of the researchers influence the kinds of responses they give. So of course, they are going to think democracy is important for science. Of course, they are going to think certain specific political features are important for science, because that's how they are accustomed to think about their own social and political institutions. So I think there's a prima facie case that if we go to Asia or Singapore, China, I'm not that acquainted with different political systems, but that people are going to have different intuitions, political, social intuitions about how to organize science. Because if there is one thing we don't agree in this world, is how we should organize society. So this is the first set of cases for why experimental philosophy can be important. And the second is a prima facie empirical case. First, there is a sinologist called Donald Monroe that argues that there is what he calls an imperial style of inquiry. Sorry for the typo here. He argues that there are specific Chinese features that influence the kind of epistemic practices that you can find in China. So they're like correlational, is something very specific. It's related to Feng Shui and to like cosmological beliefs of the Chinese people. He argues that these cosmological beliefs affect how Chinese people think about different sorts of things. So this is like a prima facie case of that there is empirical variation in epistemic practices, in scientific practices, so that we should go to discover and systematize those variations through the lenses, through the tools of experimental philosophy. The second case is Confucian economics. There's also a case in the values and science discussion to argue that central concepts in economics, like rationality, efficiency, etc., are influenced in a non-trivial way by values. So given that what Poznanski is a Polish researcher, called Confucian economics, uses a different set of concepts to talk about economic phenomena. Efficiency is not that important. Autonomous individuals are not that important for theorizing. If we accept that these concepts are tainted with values and they are replaced by other concepts, then again, there is a prima facie empirical case, empirical here being used very loosely, of course, for thinking that there are different values in Confucian economics, there are different values in social science in China that again make a case for saying there is substantive cultural variation. So we should go to look for that variation through the tools of experimental philosophy. And also, given the different political horizons for policy, I mean, Chinese people and American people have different horizons of where they want their countries to go, how to reform their systems, etc. I think that is also a prima facie case for thinking that there is going to be substantive cultural variation in the values people bring to think about science. And it's basically the third feature that I showed earlier. There is the importance. There is a prima facie case for defending that culture, social context, and the intuitions that people bear to the table are different. So if the values in science discussion aims to norm and understand values in scientific practice in today's world, given the prima facie case for substantive cultural variation and the importance of case studies, you know, the two sets of arguments that I tried to explain, then it must engage with cross-cultural experimental philosophy. This is even more the case as practitioners in the tradition have voiced the need to include the social and institutional context in the discussion. There's a famous paper by Heather Douglas in 2018. She's the one that revived the discussion of values in science, and she now argues that more than looking specifically at the scientific practices in a micro way, we should also look at the institutions that make science possible. So I think that even makes more important engaging in cross-cultural experimental philosophy. And also another very famous paper from 2014 from Dan Hicks argues that one of the goals of the discussion is to inform and guide policy. And so right now, science is usually done in international context. So the policy for science has to involve transnational context. And if their goal is to guide policy in this international context, I think they, again, should engage with cross-cultural experimental philosophy. And so the conclusion with which all experimental philosophers end, burn the armchair, you know, stop thinking about values in science from the comfort of your own American armchair, and go to the field and see how different cultures and people think about how to regulate and how to think about the values in scientific practices. So yes, so, thank you all. And if someone is interested in this discussion, you can reach me in my email there. And I don't know how I am with time, but thank you all for listening. And I hope that was clear enough so that I could spark your interest in the discussion.
Thank you so much for your fluent presentation. I really listened to it with interest, and so did everyone, I believe. We can take the questions now. Yeah, we have a question. Does experimental philosophy assume that there are philosophical theories which are posited to explain some kinds of phenomena? Or is experimental philosophy more of a scientific enterprise concerned more with social psychological aspects of attitudes towards a philosophical topic for a given culture? Is the question. Your microphone is not turned on, by the way.
Yeah, it's yeah, yeah. I don't know if I'm picking one of the options, but I would put it in this way. Given the role that traditionally intuitions have played in a discussion, even before experimental philosophy, I think the assumption here is that we as humans, as rational creatures, have implicit theories or implicit conceptions of philosophical topics. So we have like, and it's something very ancient in philosophy, like we sort of know, or we think we know what is justice, we think we know what is personal identity, what is knowledge. But then when Socrates goes to question us, we fail because we are not able to articulate our vision. I think the assumption is that we have a preconceptual or pre-theoretical or pre-articulated vision of what things are, or what knowledge is, or what personal identity is. And that that intuitive understanding is revealed in judgments about cases that are not argued, right? So yeah, I think some case is not knowledge, or I think a case is knowledge, given that it is assumed that I have a sort of pre-theoretical vision of that I know in some sense that what knowledge is. That intuition carries evidential weight, carries epistemic weight. And the point of experiential philosophy is that what if people have different responses? Like if we assume people have this intuitive understanding of what knowledge is, what are the consequences of people having different intuitions about cases? And what to do with that is a contested issue. There is some people that say, that's just a psychological curiosity that is not important for philosophy. There are people that defend that position that, this is just social psychology, why we should care as philosophers. But the more like canon, so to speak, or central experiential philosophers argue that, this is revealing something important about the concept of knowledge. This is revealing something important about these concepts. So yeah, I hope that with that context, the question was a bit more clear, but yeah, I'm not sure if I answered it.
Thank you so much. Yes, Tufan.
Yes, thank you, first of all. So do these experimental philosophers, do they check the intuitions about experimental philosophy in the, in different cultures, for example? As far as you know, because I don't.
That's an interesting question, and I'm not aware of work of like this reflective type of work, or what do people think in different cultures about this. So
yep.
I think there isn't. I'm not 100% sure, but I would bet that there hasn't been work on that yet.
Yeah, because I couldn't think of also. And so another thing is, so for example, okay, so experimental philosophers, they say, yeah, for example, very recently, I have seen a paper on the knowledge argument, for example, Mary in the black and white room. And it was an experimental philosophy paper. And then they were asking people about what they would think, right? Whether, because Frank Jackson says, when this Mary, who has never seen colors before, when she sees a color for the first time, even though she knows all the physical facts about color and color vision, she learns a new fact about human color vision, right? So this is and it is based on an intuition, right? So you are supposed to say, yeah, of course she learns something new when she experiences a new, phenomenal state. But then that paper was asking this to people, actually, not philosophers, but just non-philosophy, people. They were just asking, and then I was worried when I was reading it that maybe those people who are answering these questions didn't really understand the philosophical importance of the question there, right? Maybe they have a different understanding of what consciousness is, what constitutes consciousness, things like that, because these are very deep and technical also, philosophical terms. So then the question is, when we ask people, right, how can we be sure that they can even understand, or should we just ask to a certain kind of people, more professional than philosophers? Is it just philosophers? So for example, if you ask questions about, or if you look at the intuitions of scientists, for example, there are some scientists who say that philosophy is dead. Maybe, people say that philosophy is dead, like Stephen Hawking, for example, Richard Dawkins, So then, should we ask them, really, about any kind of philosophical debate? Can you see my point? Should there be a qualification, right? Or maybe some intuitions can be more refined than others, right? How can we, when there's a clash of intuitions, whose intuitions and what kind of intuitions should, maybe trump the others?
Yeah. The way it is usually put in discussion is that if for example, you in this philosophical context were to say, I think certain case is knowledge, or I think this is about knowledge, then I would push you for arguments, and we would have a discussion about it. But without the argument, why is it important that you believe X or Y? Like, we're asking people in surveys, why is that important? I'm going to not evade the question, but I'm going to take it to this context of the values in science. That how do we manage the institutions working with scientific knowledge in in societies at large. It's a question that affects everybody. So even if you don't have a deep acquaintance, for example, of a scientific practice, of the effects of it, of how much regulation in everyday life it depends on scientific knowledge. Even if you don't have this sort of expert background, you are still going to be affected by the decisions. So in this context, in this very specific context of values in science and scientific knowledge and regulation, I think everybody's opinion and judgments should count, because if not, then we are just like left with philosopher kings. So yeah, like there are people that have intuitions that are seasoned about science and justice and whatever. And I think even though we come from different political contexts, I think we all can agree that leaving the power to philosopher kings is not the best idea. So in this specific context, I would argue that we don't need expertise. But in the more philosophically interesting context, for example, knowledge, justice, where we're doing like philosophy in the philosophy with big P, so to speak. Yeah, in that case, I cannot give you the answer yet, but thanks.
Yeah, okay. So then in some cases, at least, so you're seeing that this is more like a democratic kind of a way of doing philosophy, right? So including other people who will be affected by it. So, and one can say then the main aim there on those cases, at least, not the truth, right? Maybe not a method of reaching it to the truth, but rather maybe the most legitimate way of doing it. So like one can say the same thing about democracy, right? Maybe through democracy, if the people are not sufficiently educated, you can say, then it is not the best way of determining who's the best fit to govern the state. However, you can say, even though that's the case, still it is the most legitimate, right? Through democracy, you can elect the most legitimate, ruler, or the ruling, group or something. And it sounded like you are thinking a similar kind of thing in some cases. Yeah, thank you.
That was a very nice articulation of what I said.
Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. If you don't have any other question, we can end the whole conference actually, because that was our last speaker. Let's wait for 15 seconds or so. All right, I don't think we have any other question. Thank you so much again, Nicolas. That was such a nice presentation.